I remember the day the wind turned the sky into chalk. It was a Tuesday. I think it was a Tuesday because Mr. Fury's whistle sounded a little earlier than the Monday hooter, and my mother had just scolded my sister for taking the last bit of sugar for her tea. That's what my mind does when I try to remember, it goes to small things first. The way my hands felt on the bucket handle. The taste of dust on the lip of the well. The number of donkeys tied to the gum tree. The noise of men and picks and the smell of the lime kilns baking stone into something even whiter than the clouds. The air always tasted like we were chewing rocks, and if I licked my teeth before sleeping, a grit would slide over my tongue like sand. Sometimes my mother said, "Cabello, one day the dust is going to settle inside you and will shake you and you'll rattle like a gourd." Then she would laugh, and I would laugh if she wasn't in a serious mood. In those days, our house was just one wall away from the eyes of the quarry. If you stood at the fence with one foot on the bottom wire and your heel dug into the hard ground, you could see the men at the big face, the cliff that was once a soft hill when water ran and frogs sang, as my grandfather liked to say. Now it was a staircase of stone where African men and some from far-off farms, and a few thin white men who carried clipboards, were peeling back the hill like a giant was hiding something precious inside and had glued it shut with time. They worked with chisels that called to each other and picks that sounded like hard rain on a tin roof. They drilled little holes and pushed in sticks of gelignite and ran rope fuses back like snakes in the dust. Then everybody would raise a hand and the foreman would check nobody's head was about to be missing by accident. No, that's not how he said it. I say it now with a smile because when you're 12 you think you won't be the one who is unlucky, and then he would light the fuses and tuck his fingers in his ears. The cliff would jump. The air would slap your chest. Pebbles would chase each other. And the hill would fall a little more. We lived in Tong, the place my father said meant place of the lion. He told me how the battle happening had given the name, and how his own grandfather heard lions coughing at night near the Harts River. I never saw a lion. But I saw plenty of the things lions have time for: dust, bones, hot afternoons when even the dogs didn't feel like barking, and the kind of silence you only get between blasts at the quarry, when everything seems to suck in its breath together waiting for the next noise. I'm telling you this because it's the ground I stand on. If you know the ground I stand on, you'll understand how it happened that a piece of stone I could barely carry ended up inside a wooden crate headed south on a train and then into the hands of a man in Johannesburg who would open it in the middle of a wedding party and use my grandmother's kind of knitting needles to uncover a face in the rock. He would give that face a name in Latin, a name that meant the southern ape of Africa, and there would be men who said he was wrong and others who said he must be right, and I would sit under the gum tree kicking dust at my toes wondering what it meant that the stone had come from our quarry and that I had touched it and felt its weight first. The morning it first started as a story, I mean, because the stone itself started long before us. A goat had snuck into our yard. My mother was making pap and humming something I can still hear if I close my eyes, and I was thinking about how to ask her for an extra slice of fat to chew with my pap, when my sister screamed and pointed at the goat. The goat had put its foot in our water bucket. No one knows how fast your feet can move until it's your water that has been spoiled by a goat. We chased it, I threw my hat, my sister tripped and made a noise like a kettle when it boils, and my mother came out with the wooden spoon raised as if the goat could understand a woman's threat in any language. The goat leaped our little fence, put its head down, and in 3 kicks it was past the path and into the space where the donkey carts gathered. That same path cut across the open sandy place where the men used to leave broken tufa blocks and pale flakes of old shells like the quarry was the belly of a giant fish we were slicing open. There were men already sweating in their shirts. I saw Simon, who was older than me 17, he said, though he had a face like someone the dust has been scowling at a long time, and he waved at me with one hand and shoved the crowbar under a slab with the other. I liked Simon because he saw the world in small pieces but never missed the whole picture. He would pick up a piece of bone and say, "This one is springbok by the curve," or "This is not from anything you eat, this is a hyena tooth, look how mad it looks." His father had been killed by a rock that fell the wrong way when he was little, but he never said it like a story. He just wore it in his eyes like a shadow. He laughed a lot for someone with a shadow in his eyes. The goat ran between two wheelbarrows and turned around to stare at us like we were in its way. Mr. Furi shouted something in Afrikaans that my sister wasn't supposed to repeat, and seemed to enjoy repeating even more. Then the compressor coughed and started its whirring song, and the goat decided it had had enough and trotted away like it had just done us a favor. That's when I saw it. At first I thought it was just more of the usual, a pale block with darker bits inside like the stone had swallowed some shade. We found bones all the time. My mother would say, "Bana ba matimo, leave bones where they are," but she didn't mean the stone ones, she meant the fresh ones that dogs dragged. The stone ones looked fake and real at the same time, like the inside of a honeycomb you can't eat. The quarry made them every day, spit them out, really. When the blasting broke the old cave open and told us that a long time ago something had lived here and died here and was still here in another way. This was a block that had a face if you turned it. I didn't know it at first. I walked past and then walked back because I felt like someone had looked at me. This is a strange thing to say about a block of stone, and I don't expect you to believe me if you weren't there. But all my life, even now, when something important is near me, my skin knows before my eyes do. A chill runs down even if the sun is loud. I came closer, and the dust in the air made a thin light around everything like the house of God in the pictures in the clinic where the nurse kept bandages and free pamphlets from the government. There was the block, the size of a baby goat, with a raw white side where it had just been chipped. And inside it, like a flower pressed between two pages in a Bible, something that looked like two big round places and a little ridge above and something like a tiny mouth. I said, "Simon." Then louder, "Simon." He was at my shoulder before I finished saying his name. He had seen too many rocks for anything to surprise him much, but sometimes something would chuckle in his chest when he found an unusual piece. He bent down, put his fingers on the smooth part, blew the dust. Then he did that thing I think about sometimes when he looked at a girl later at the well, his face went very careful, and he leaned in like a man at the mouth of a cave. He touched the edges. He looked at me. His laugh didn't come out. We didn't know then to call it a skull. We called it a face in the stone. The white men later called it an endocast, and I learned to say the word because it felt like the taste of a mint, cool and precise. But that morning it was a face in a stone block, with two round eyes that weren't eyes anymore but the space where the eyes had been, and a ridge that could be a brow if you wanted it to be. It wasn't big. If you pressed your hands to make the space of a bread loaf, it would fit. Part of it looked like a brain made of rock, with folds, like someone had pressed a loaf into wet clay and it remembered. Another part looked like bone, but it was turned to stone too, a mask almost, with holes where the nose would be and tiny teeth in a tiny jaw. I touched it and felt the surprising smoothness. The stone around it was rough. But the face itself had been polished by something, water, time, the rubbing of men's hands, the rubbing of the quarry cart. I don't know. It was like kneeling at the river and feeling where the rock has been sat on by many people. I think the two of us would have crouched there for an hour if the whistle had not called and if Mr. Furi had not seen us and come over like a dog seeing two boys hiding a sweet behind a wall. "What's this?" he said, spitting to the side as if even his spittle hated the dust. Another bloody baboon from our ancestors, he said, and then he laughed at his own joke. That's what they all said. Baboons. The quarry sometimes spat out a monkey's skull cap, and the men with clipboards would wrap it with brown paper and string and call it something with a Latin name, and a week later you'd get an envelope with some coins and a note that said thank you and please send more. This was the part I liked. I liked money, because you could buy sugar, and sugar made tea taste like a sundae. Simon lifted the block, and not even he could pretend it wasn't heavy. I grabbed the other side without being asked. Mr. Furry touched the smooth part and frowned like he had swallowed a fly. He said, "Wait. You." And pointed at me. "Get a crate, quick. And a towel." "No, two. We're not making it bleed," I thought, but I ran anyway to the shed. The shed smelled like spilled paraffin and oil and old leather. The crates were against the far wall. I lifted the lightest one. On the shelf by the door there were 2 old flour sacks, and I took them too because I never learned to bring only what a man asked for. I brought too much. That's my way. We put the sacks under the block, and then together we made a bed. Mr. Furry surprised me by how gentle his fingers could be with the rock. We settled it as if we were laying a child down, and I saw Simon's eyes go somewhere else for a second, maybe to that shadow place where his father was, and then return. We put wood chips in the corners so the block wouldn't bang around like a dumb beast, and we nailed the lid down with small movements, like we were afraid of waking it. "This is for the professor," Mr. Furry said, but he said professor how old Tswana women say the word philosophy when they joke about someone who uses big words to hide a small brain. I had heard the name before, Professor Dart. The foreman didn't say it with love or respect, he said it like a man who knew that you could get money from a man no matter what you think of him. He did know, we all knew, that when a letter came from Johannesburg it sometimes came with a coin, and sometimes that coin was the difference between meat or no meat. The manager of the lime works had put up a notice months ago, "The University of the Witwatersrand requests unusual fossil-bearing breccia." There were drawings of what to look for. Teeth, skull bits, odd patterns. And we had found baboon heads and antelope horns turned to stone, and once half a pig that made even the cook, who had seen plenty, shake his head and cross himself. We had never found a face like this one. "Do you think it's a child?" I asked. I knew even then that questions are coins. You don't throw them around without thinking, but sometimes you spend one and it opens a door. Simon looked at me as if someone had just said a word in a language he didn't know in the middle of a song he did. He looked at the tiny teeth. The little shape that wasn't entirely monkey and wasn't entirely what I see in the mirror every morning. He didn't answer. We carried the crate to the office. It was cooler inside. The clerk, a thin man with hair like a bottle brush, wrote down something in a ledger with a pencil that squeaked. He said, "Tong. Buxton Lime Works. 1 block of breccia, with primate material." Simon said, "Prim what?" And the man smiled without his eyes. He said, "Ape." He asked to see it and then he didn't. He wrote Dart on the top of the paper with a stroke that could cut wood. That night, our yard smelled of cooked corn and the sweet smoke from the kilns that never slept. My mother washed my hands with the rough soap she made herself. She held my fingers in the water like they might break if she squeezed too hard, but also like I had done something she couldn't decide about whether it was good or bad. "We are not hyenas," she said. "We don't eat bones." I said, "It's for the professor," and she laughed a little through her nose, the way she did when she didn't want to be caught laughing by anyone outside the house. A professor. She told me to fetch more wood. I fetched it. Under the gum tree that night, my grandfather sat on one leg with his other foot tucked under him like the old men do. He held his pipe like it was the neck of a small bird and looked at the fire. The stars were busy. I told him about the block. He spat to the side in a way that made my mother say, "Tisk, not near the pap pot." I told him about the round holes and the small teeth. He grunted and said, "You boys and your dirt toys." But then he told me a story about a time when the gods of the caves were angry and a village threw sweet beer and goat fat into a sinkhole to make the spirits eat and be happy again. He said the land liked a gift. He said, "You take things out, you better give something back, or the land will take something you didn't offer." Maybe that's why I didn't sleep well. Or maybe it was the thought of the little face in the stone. I lay on my mat listening to my sister snore a little in her sleep like someone tapping a drum lightly with a finger, and I thought about the breath that might have puffed out of those small nostrils, and the fingers that might have reached out and curled and uncurled, and whether it had a mother who had combed sand out of its hair. I couldn't stop thinking that once it had been warm. The thought crawled into my chest and curled up against my heart. For a long time, nothing much happened. That's what life does. You think you just stepped into a river and you will be carried to the sea. But sometimes the river is a field and you have to carry yourself across it step by step. Days went by with their own little dramas, a hen that disappeared and then was found sitting on 12 eggs under a broken crate, a boy who broke his toe and howled like a jackal until his mother slapped him and made him angry enough to forget the pain, a letter from my uncle in Vryburg saying the rains were a month late and the veldt looked like a man whose ribs you can count from across the room. Every afternoon, the quarry would shudder, and new blocks would tumble down, and men would pick through them with the same careful hands they used to pick their teeth, and my eyes would scan the ground for anything that looked like it had something to say. I started walking the waste heaps more. The men called them the dumps, as if they had thrown away the life of the hill and piled it in neat rows. There were all sorts of things there, bits of ancient stalactites like the teeth of a giant, shards of shells that had been laid down when my grandfather's ancestors walked on the bottom of a lake, and bones that had turned to a sweet chalk. There were hyena coprolites, the older boys called them, that once a white scientist told them the word, which is a clean way to say the rocks were once hyena dung full of the ground up bits of other animals. I loved those. I used to imagine the hyena that squatted in the dark cave a long time ago, grinning at the moonlight at the entrance, swallowing and chewing and swallowing again, same as us with stew, except it had a laugh prettier than ours and longer teeth. When something has happened that you don't fully understand, you look for signs. I would see round things and think eyes. I would see little jawbones and think voice. I would dream of teeth and wake up biting my tongue and tasting the tiny iron of my own blood and feel ashamed because my mother would think I had turned into a hyena after all. Some of the old people said, "Leave that business to men who were not born here. It is theirs to dig and search for ghosts in the ground." Others said, "If the land wants to show us something, who are we to close our eyes?" I was carrying a sloshing milk pail from a farmer's cart back to our hut one afternoon when the manager, an Englishman with a red nose, always peeling and never tan, called out to the men to gather. He had a piece of paper in his hand that shook a little. He read in a loud voice in English, and then the foreman said the same thing in Afrikaans and then in Bad Setswana for the men who appreciated the try. A letter had come from the University of the Witwatersrand's anatomy department. The professor had opened the crate. He wanted more from that same part of the dump where the block came from. He wanted any piece that looked like it matches. The word match made me stand taller. I liked it. It made me think of the little wooden sticks my grandfather struck against the striker strip and brought fire out of wood. The men murmured. Their eyes became little plows, turning over the ground in their imagination before their hands could. The manager said there would be a bonus for any piece that was accepted by the university. He said a number that made a noise in my belly like hunger but more pleasant. Even Mr. Fury didn't make a joke. He pointed to Simon. He pointed to me. He pointed to two others. He said, "You boys, show them where you found that first block." I took them to the place like a dog that has been told to fetch a stick but doesn't trust that its people will be able to see it if he drops it at their feet. There was nothing there now except the little scar where our block had come out and some other blocks tumbled nearby. But if you squinted and tilted your head a certain way, the dump heap looked like a frozen wave. I told them how the piece had been lying with its smooth side up, how the sun had found a path to lick it. Simon showed them a nick on his knuckle, where the block had caught him. He smiled. Everybody spread out. For 2 days, maybe 3, the quarry looked like a market, except what we were buying was buried and the seller was not in a hurry to take our money. The men scraped. They lifted. They made little sounds to themselves like hummingbirds and big sounds like clouds. They muttered words in languages I don't know but that sounded like prayer, the ones men say when they are hungry for something they cannot eat. The women came, a few. Mostly they watched from the fence. My mother said it was like watching men scratch a rash. And if I laughed, she told me not to laugh at the work of men even if it looked silly. My sister wanted to look too. I told her to go fetch water and that if she spilled it I would tell mother that she had put a goat foot in it again. It was on the second afternoon that Simon made a noise that had no word. He held up a sliver. He knew before the rest of us what it was, I think. It was a tiny piece with the rhythmic bumps of teeth's roots. Ours are for one kind of eating, my grandfather told me, and the monkeys are for another. The piece had human story to it. Not a whole story, just a word, like once, and you want to say, upon a time, but you can't yet. We put that piece in a cloth and then in a biscuit tin, and we wrote on the tin with charcoal, and I felt like I was putting away a bead from a necklace that had broken a long time ago and that wanted to be whole again. A truck came from Vryburg to take the first crate and the biscuit tin and another crate with nothing but rock and hope. I climbed onto the back when the driver looked away, and the ride to the station pounded the bottoms of my feet up through my skull. The railway men at the Tong station were always kind to me because my grandfather used to bring them bags of pumpkins when the vines had a good year. The station had a shade the quarry never had. There was a timetable pinned up, and I could read all the numbers, every single one. I had learned numbers faster than letters. Letters took moods. Numbers stayed numbers all day long. The station master wore a clean white shirt even though his hands were black with oil. He stamped a paper with the weight. He stamped another paper with the date. He smoked and made a little blue house around his head with the smoke. At sunset, I went back for the last cart. On the way home, the kills had already started to glow. Sometimes they looked like dragons with their mouths half open, showing you their red teeth. Men were feeding them. Lime powder puffed out and made everything ghost soft. My legs were tired, but my mind was not. My grandfather was in our yard with a boy from the church talking about a verse in the Bible I didn't know. They argued about whether the Tower of Babel was taller than the fig tree in Mafeking, and they laughed and agreed that it was when you look up from the ground. He waved at me and I waved and didn't stop walking because I wanted to lie down and also I wanted to see if I could fall asleep without making the face in the stone show up in my head. I did that thing again where I tell you I wanted both things at once because that is what I am like. The next day, another letter. The manager read it with his eyebrows first before his mouth did the job. This one said, "More pieces arrived. Extraordinary." The paper said the professor, now they used his full name, Professor Raymond A. Dart, had been, what was the word? Exultant. The clerk looked at me as if I would have learned that word in church, and then repeated it in a word we all knew, happy, so happy. There was a line that said, "The endocast appears exceptional, please keep any pieces from the facial region, especially the maxilla and mandible." No one said that word the way the paper did. The foreman called it the jaw, the top part and the bottom part. It was funny to hear the paper talk like that, like a teacher who can't cook pap telling an old woman how to stir. We went back. I started to dream not just of the face but of him as a little boy. I say him because he felt like a him, though maybe that was a trick of my mind. Maybe because if it were a her, I would have thought of my sister, and something about the feeling made me protest like a hen whose chick is near. I saw him at the edge of an old cave opening, his little hands on a rock. I saw him watching some adult with a stick. No, it wasn't like we imagine, with fire and everything. It was just another day for him. The same heat, the same flies that love your eyes more than any other part of your face. He would scratch his scalp and make little noises. He would take a piece of something and put it in his mouth and spit it out, and someone bigger would say a sound that meant don't. Then I would wake up. I would try to scoop that little boy out of the dark and carry him into my day where we have kills and trains and tin cups, but I couldn't. He had died, and the cave had folded over him, and water had dripped and stone had grown around him like bread dough rising around raisins. There was a Sunday between those days when life pretended not to be excited. At church the preacher talked about how God wrote our names on his hand, and my mother cried a little because she always thought of my brother who didn't live more than 3 days after he was born, and how she had washed those 3 days with her tears. I held her hand until she squeezed me too tight and I pulled away with a little whine and then felt ashamed for sounding like a dog. After church, we ate rice because someone had sent money in the last letter that the manager had cut up and redistributed and then not told us exactly how much he had cut off. My mother said, "Don't worry, God is watching the manager too," and I imagined his eye over the clipboard. On Monday morning, Simon and I were still in our Sunday minds, I think. We moved slower. The heat was already crawling. The quarry had a smell like a copper penny you put your mouth on because someone dared you. We split up to cover more ground. He went left to the pile that slumped toward the small thorn tree, and I went right to the one that rose like a termite mound. I kicked a small depression with my heel and my heel told me before my eyes did, there was a difference in the way the ground pushed back. The stone underneath had a heartbeat, not a real one of course, but one the same as when you rest your head on a barrel when someone is hammering the other side. I squatted. Poked with a stick. The stick came up with whiteness and dirt. I scraped with my fingers and let the grains fall slow. I had learned to let the soil show me, not force it. A curve appeared, like the roof of a small mouth. I breathed through my nose so I wouldn't fog my own eyes with excitement. It was a little piece, curved, with tiny little points where teeth fit in like little men in a row. The way it was curved, I thought it was the top of a mouth. The bone was stone, but it held fineness the way a song holds its pitch even when you hum it quietly with your lips closed. I called to Simon. He came. He crouched. He looked the way he had looked at the first block. And then he did a thing I love him for to this day. He put his hand on the ground next to it like he was patting a sleeping dog and said, "We are going to take you to meet your friend." We worked with our knives and our nails. The foreman called the manager and the manager called the clerk and the clerk called for a box and a towel, and the towel somehow looked more important than any of us. We wrapped that little piece inside a piece of old paper. The paper had a story from the papers on it about gold mine shares, and I laughed because the treasure inside had nothing to do with the numbers on the outside. We put it with the biscuit tin. We made a new tin because it felt like we were putting two different families in the same house, and ask anyone in Tong if two families in one house do not argue. We would have argued too. That afternoon, the wind came up, the kind that steals your hat and your patience. Men's shirts blew like flags on their bodies. The dust made the world small. I saw Simon squint and spit. He said if he were in charge he would make a law, no work on days the wind tries to make a bedroom inside your mouth. I laughed, and then I had to hold my hat in my mouth and keep my breath shallow so my tongue would not choke on talcum. Even the donkeys had their ears plastered to their necks and their eyes sealed like cans. But we stayed. I think we would have slept there if the watchman hadn't pushed us out with his stick at sundown. The next letter from Johannesburg took longer, as if it had to push against the same wind. The station master said the train was late because a herd of cattle had been driven along the line and they got inside the fence, and then someone had to shoe them, and one of the cows had decided to have her calf right there. He told the story laughing, and I laughed, and I think about it now and I still laugh because men and their plans are nothing to a cow who is going to have her baby. When the letter finally came, it was in a fatter envelope. The manager opened it. Inside was another letter in thinner paper, like onion skin. And something winked in the sunlight, coins. Two of them, shining like the eyes of a cat at night. The men came closer as if the letter had a smell. The manager cleared his throat. He read out, "The pieces you have sent are of the greatest importance. The face and brain cast are congruent, belonging to the same juvenile specimen." I know that's what it said because the clerk said the word juvenile and then said child like he was making it easier for us, and that word kicked me in the chest. Congruent, the manager said again because he liked the way it made his mouth feel. Then he said the professor wanted us to search for more of the lower jaw. Mandible, he said, and Simon whispered to me, "Your mouth is clever when it says big words." The letter said that the professor had been at a wedding when the first crate arrived and had left the guests to open it, and had shouted so loud his wife had come to see what the fuss was, and he had shouted again and then gone very quiet the way people do when they are about to say something important. He had sent a boy to the neighbor to borrow knitting needles. He had worked for hours, scraping and poking and lifting, sweating a bit even though it was a party. The picture in my head was so clear I could smell the cake. He had written that the face was not like a baboon's, not like a monkey's the way non-scientists might think, but something in between the apes and us. He had written, "Africa may indeed be the cradle of humankind." He had underlined it. The manager read it and then read it again when he heard the murmurs. He looked embarrassed by the largeness of it all. He preferred numbers, and numbers were not enough that day. I went to the mission school that afternoon. I liked to go there not because I loved books but because I liked the way paper felt when you turned it, and I liked how the room smelled like chalk and ink and the floor had a shine even when no one had polished it. Miss Jacobs, the teacher, had a newspaper from Johannesburg. She was a small woman with strong wrists. She clapped her hands and quiet came like a wind after a storm. She told us about a fossil that a professor had named Australopithecus africanus. She made us say it, and I watched my friends' mouths, especially the ones with the big blunted teeth because I always admired teeth since the stone one, to see them try to lasso a word like that. She said it means southern ape of Africa. She told us the professor believed the child had walked upright, not knuckle-walked like a chimp. She said his brain was small compared to ours but not for his age, that the baby teeth and the growth lines were telling. She talked about the big men in London who thought the first people came from Europe or Asia, and how now this find might make them look differently to Africa. After school, the preacher came. He had heard the same thing as Miss Jacobs, but his eyes made storms when he looked at the idea. He said, "God made man. We are not from apes." He shook the newspaper like it was a naughty boy. Miss Jacobs said it was not against God to learn how God did it. He made her words soft, but they were rocks. I stood between them feeling like a dog in a thunderstorm who wants to run under the bed and knows that if he does, the thunder will still be there. My grandfather said later, men fight over who the father is. They don't think maybe the father and the mother can share. He always had a way with words, putting two things in one basket and making them sit together without biting. There was a day after that when I found a tooth. It was tiny and sharp with a shape like a mountain that has had its top knocked off. I held it in my hand and felt the way its tiny tip pricked me. I imagined it in the mouth of that child and another tooth next to it and another. I imagined him biting into something hard and feeling the satisfaction that comes when your teeth meet and you own that piece of the world for 1 second. We wrapped the tooth, and I didn't want to let go. It felt like a brother even though I had never seen his face. This is a strange family, I know. If you are wondering whether the professor came to see us then, the answer is no. He sent letters. He sent coins. Later he would send a man with a kind face and a notebook who sweated like the rest of us and swatted flies and said sorry when he stepped on a chicken. But at first, it was just paper and us and our hands. I remember the day the man came though, before I forget. He wore a hat that had changed from white to the color of tea with too much milk. He had a line on his forehead that told me he worried about things you couldn't fix with money. He had a bag with the University of the Witwatersrand written on it. The men said his name was Mr. Peabody or Pepler or Peak. My ear took it one way and someone else's took it another, and he smiled like a man who knows he is not the first choice but is going to do his best anyway. He shook hands with the manager and shook hands with the foreman and then did a thing I loved him for. He shook hands with me too, like a person, not like a small thing that had been included. He said, "Hello, young man," in a voice that had sandpaper but also honey. He wanted to see the dump. We showed him. He looked at the ground the way a hunter looks for game, not at it exactly but through it, at the edges, the trails, the accidental corners where something tells on itself. He crouched and touched with 2 fingers like a mother checking the forehead of a child for fever. He asked me to show him where the first block had been. I did. He took out a little sketchbook and drew. I liked the way he did it, quick lines, small marks, then a soft shading that made the stone look like something a person could eat, like a bread loaf again, because everything important in my life is a bread loaf if you ask my stomach. He talked about caves in the hill that had long ago collapsed and filled with old bones and sand and the cement that water makes when it fancies itself a master mason. He talked about hyenas dragging leftovers into the dark and eating there and leaving their smelly eggs, which would become the coprolites my tongue had learned to enjoy pronouncing. He spoke about how water drips through calcium and leaves a cake. He made us all look at the face of the quarry like a doctor looks at a cut, not to be afraid of it but to understand what happened. He was polite, that man. I can't remember now if he had children. He never said. He said home the way an Englishman says it, with the roundness like a stone in his mouth he couldn't swallow. For weeks, we lived 2 lives. The old one, where men worked and women cooked and chickens stole things and goats sinned against buckets of water. And the new one, where the quarry became a place where the ground was giving us a story. The children in the village started picking up every white pebble they saw, running to their mothers screaming the word fossil even if they couldn't say it right, and their mothers got irritated and then realized they were proud to have a future scientist in the house, and everybody laughed and some women told each other that science better bring meat and not just long words. At night, the stars seemed to lean closer. I would lie on my mat and think of the child again. I would hear, or imagine I heard, a sort of crying that wasn't crying but the wind in the grass. I would remember how the old men talked about owls not as bad luck like some people think, but as watchers, how, in our stories, a big bird can be a messenger. Later, much later, I would hear some white scientists say that maybe a big bird had taken the child, that the marks around the eyes of the skull were like the marks on bones that eagles leave when they make a meal. I don't know. I think about the night noises we heard: hyenas, leopards sometimes, birds that make the hair on your neck sit up because they talk like people, and I think any of them could have done it. I think death in the bush does not come with a calling card. But the stone holds its secrets, and it tells them to those who know its language. I learned just enough of that language to ask where it came from and how a thing can be soft and then become hard and still talk. One afternoon, the preacher came to the quarry. He had put cologne on because he thought the lime dust might be less rude to him if he smelled expensive. It wasn't. It got in every crease like always. He came because he had heard Miss Jacobs was telling children that we came from apes. He was kind to her at church, but he couldn't let this go. He strode to the spot where children and women were standing behind the fence and said loudly that God breathed into Adam and we did not crawl out of a cave and stand up. Miss Jacobs, who had come because she loved real things as much as she loved ideas, said that if God made Adam, he made the cave too, and he made the bones and he put them where we could find them. She said our job is to read his handwriting in rock as well as in the Bible. People looked from one to the other the way you look at two donkeys pulling in two directions and wonder when the harness will snap. The preacher asked me what I thought because I was a boy and boys are sometimes dragged into adult storms and told to be the lightning. I said I thought the bones made me feel like the earth was older than I had imagined and that maybe that made God bigger, not smaller. I said I thought finding the child made me think about my brother who had died and how I wanted God to tell me he had written his name on his hand, and also I wanted to know how old bones become new stones. The preacher put his hand on my head and said, "Be careful, Cabello. You can fall in love with finding and forget who is to be found." Miss Jacobs looked like she wanted to loosen her hair and wash her face and start over and talk to me quietly with no men around. She said only, "Keep your eyes open, Cabello. For everything." And the preacher laughed like a man who tasted something he thought would be bitter and found it sweet. I was on the station platform when another crate went south. I had run there in bare feet and hid them under the bench because the splinters in the planks were bigger than any porcupine quill and I had pride. The platform smelled like creosote and oranges from crates that held a picture of a smiling white girl on their sides. A black fly walked on my ankle and I tried to squash it with the other foot and nearly fell, and an old woman laughed and said, "It's a good thing God gave you 2 feet so you can at least share your foolishness between them," and I said, Madame," and kept my eyes on the train line like looking at it would make the train come faster. It did not. Trains move in their own time, like goats and grandparents. When the letter came saying they had freed the little jaw from the matrix, another new word, matrix, which I loved as much as I loved bread because it meant the stone skin the bones are stuck in and that it fitted the face like a baby to its mother's shoulder, I ran around our yard and knocked over 2 buckets and my mother clapped me with her tongue without touching me and I said, "He has a jaw." And she said, "Who?" And I said, "The child in the stone," and she made a sound in her throat I had never heard before, half a laugh, half a sob, like she was being tickled while crying. The letter said the monyana the little one had molars just coming through. It said the roots showed his age. It said the pattern of the palate was closer to ours than to a baboon's. It said many things. It said that the professor